over to you.
Okay, hello, welcome. I'm Sue Parker Hall and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Zac Fine. We're therapists, we work in private practice, we work with a diverse group of clients across a wide range of issues, but something we share in common is an interest in men's and boys' issues. Together, we are the other half. The other half is the other half of the story. We feel quite rightly women and girls' issues have been well addressed and continue to be, but we don't feel that men's issues and boys' issues have been given quite the same attention. So that's what we're here to do, to explore how we can improve our service, our psychotherapy and counselling services to men and boys. We've talked about 2 chapters so far from the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology and Mental Health. The first one was about looking at archetypes rather than stereotypes, a kind of evolutionary perspective, and then we had a positive look at testosterone, didn't we? Good look at.
Yeah.
So this is the 3rd chapter we're looking at. This was my pick, so I'm going to introduce it. It's Games People Play, the Collapse of Masculinities and the Rise of Masculinity as Spectacle. I'll tell you a little bit about the author first, and then unpick, maybe just introduce. I'll just do a short introduction to the book and you can take it from there, Zac.
Right.
So Damien Ridge is a professor of health studies at the University of Westminster in London. He's published over 80 papers. He's got a particular interest in depression, and he has authored a book on depression, Recovering from Depression, a narrative approach. The book's aimed at doctors, complementary therapists, and mental health professionals. He's got broad interests. He works with a wide range of patients, but one of his interests is masculinity and working with men. And he provides psychodynamic therapy in the community. I didn't read his profile until after I'd finished the chapter, and to be honest, I was a bit surprised to find out that he was a health professional and a psychodynamic therapist. I really enjoyed reading his chapter, and I thought his academic voice was really strong, but not quite so much from a health professional perspective or from a psychotherapist, although Melanie Klein was mentioned once when he talked about the good woman, bad man polarization.
I must have missed that. I can't remember seeing that.
Yeah, just mentioned once. Yeah. Yeah, and I was a sociologist before I was a psychotherapist, and I quite liked symbolic interactionism, the idea that identity behaviours are born out of an interaction between individuals and between individuals, and that they're open to different interpretations, and same behaviour can have different intentions, and I like that kind of rich interpersonal approach. So I was pleased to see him using that. So the title Games People Play, well, I was attracted to that because I'm a transactional analyst psychotherapist, so I was thinking it might be along the lines of transactional analysis, but it isn't. It's a really interesting phenomenon, if I got that right. It's the collapse of masculinities and the rise of masculinity as spectacle. Well, I really wish he had defined his terms actually in the first couple of paragraphs, because I spent quite a bit of time researching the terms, looking at the different understanding of the terms. But what it boils down to is he sees masculinity as a form of performance, which happens in different contexts with different purposes and can be interpreted in different ways. And the metaphor that came to my mind was a kaleidoscope. I really like the kaleidoscope metaphor of, you know, the kind of changing shapes and patterns, and the idea that you may think you're offering one behavior or something, and somebody else completely reinterprets it and makes it into something else.
Yes, I think I feel like for me that's quite a powerful idea as well.
Yeah.
And you may not be conscious of what you're performing, or you may be very conscious and it might be a kind of cynical performance.
Yes, that's true. And there may be layers.
Yeah.
There may be layers. Yeah.
And I immediately, of course, I started thinking about the family court system, and like any display of masculinity. Actually, no, that's not fair. Some displays of masculinity are pathologized, whereas others are just assumed to be natural, like earning money and having a job is seen as, well, it's still not, it's just a bit of a father, whereas trying to assert dominance.
Zac, you broke up a little bit. You got as far as the family court system. I wonder if, would you mind repeating?
Yeah, sorry.
Any performances of masculinity?
Yeah,
in the court system.
Yeah, so the idea that the audience can be looking out for certain things, or consciously or unconsciously just missing things. So I think it's fair to say that the judiciary is quite traditional in some respects. You know, magistrates are still quite traditional in some respects, although not others. And one of them, it seems, is that while on the one hand they don't like to see dads being too what's the word, as dominant seeking in terms of their role as a parent, but simultaneously they sort of take for granted that the father should provide, and, you know, provide money and have a job and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's just what was coming up for me when you described the kaleidoscope thing.
Yeah,
we perform some kinds of masculinity, and audiences see some kinds of masculinity in different ways.
And I think what you might be saying, Zac, is some men can become unstuck performing the wrong masculinity in a family court situation. Yeah. So he began the chapter by saying, and this was like a breath of fresh air for me, he began the chapter by saying that everyday lived reality for men can seem at odds with the feminist discourse on masculinity. The idea of a patriarchal structure where men have power over women and other like subordinate men. Certainly the men I work with in my practice don't often experience the world in that way. Often they can feel very disempowered actually, and on occasions dominated themselves actually by a female partner. So this is a bit of a fresh air. He argues that men themselves, and you can say better than me about this, but men themselves actually experience their masculinity in ways that don't always resonate with feminist discourses.
I can definitely say that, yeah. Although it's interesting, because when I was a student of anthropology at Goldsmiths College in London, I really the feminist discourse really resonated with me at that point in my life. So I felt both, but at the moment it doesn't.
I suppose I would talk about myself as a recovered feminist. I think, it made sense to me at one time. I'm not sure if it made sense to me because there was a kind of ideological brainwashing going on, or whether it actually spoke to me in my lived experience. But I don't need to know, really.
I quite liked the subversiveness of the postmodern agenda. Like everything is impossible in a sense, and so nothing there's a bit in this where he quotes some Judith Butler, and it's sort of like encapsulating that whole nihilistic project of undermining the whole concept of identity. So so then what? I think as a sort of older man, I've kind of got to the point where I am living in the real world. I'm a provider, I've got kids, and I kind of need a bit more than postmodernist rhetoric. I kind of need something solid to live. And
a more stronger self-definition than the postmodern. And the kind of postmodern approach seems quite anarchic to me. It's like we blow everything
very destructive. I mean, I think it's healthy to it's healthy to have push and pull of theoretic debate over the decades, isn't it? But I wondered when I was doing anthropology, I sort of kept wondering, okay, so I don't get where else there is to go. We've got Foucault, and then we're in this sort of, don't know what to call it. There wasn't any solid ground anymore. And there definitely, at that point, there was no way to sort of start saying, well, maybe there's something good about Western civilization. I think that's where I've slowly got to since then. But
there's something about deconstruction and critical analysis is really important. I think those skills are really important. But for my mental health, I actually need there to be
something
concrete reality.
And I think you're no different from your clients. I mean, that's what our clients. I mean, stop me if I'm going to go off topic here, but the article that you noticed in Therapy Today, the BACP journal. There was an article in November 2019 by
Manu Bazzano,
and he said some stuff in that really, I just thought, well, how is that supposed to help our clients? I wrote one of them down here. Hang on, let me just see if I can find it, because it's sort of some aspects of. I know the author of this article that we're talking about is doing an overview of a lot of the theory, but I'm still uncomfortable with some of the blithe acceptance of some of the theory that he seems to do. And again, like you, I didn't really get his voice as a therapist at all. I just didn't hear it. Anyway, this is a quote from the piece by Manu Bazzano. Queer theory teaches us that fixed notions of heterosexual masculinity around which the conventional family is constructed imply the mourning of homosexual desire. So where's the I just don't know where the client is and stuff like that. I just think
no, I mean that might well be his perspective. Maybe that's been his journey. But to kind of universalize a personal journey is not terribly helpful, is it? No. So Damien pretty quickly draws our attention to white heterosexual, what he calls deprived men, who do feel somewhat powerless, who've been left out of the prevailing liberal discourse. Well, I wonder whether it's the prevailing feminist discourse, but he said liberal discourse. The kind of men who voted for Donald Trump, for Brexit. I'm saying for Brexit. Damian Ridge doesn't Or for Boris Johnson, again, I'm saying that he just talks about Donald Trump.
He does mention Brexit actually, but
oh, did he?
Yeah.
Oh dear, I missed that. And he also draws us to men who've been sexually assaulted. So he talks about Warren Farrell's story. Warren Farrell was a male feminist in the 80s. And more latterly, he's turned his attention to issues of men's and boys. And I just draw our attention to male victims of domestic violence as well, because he doesn't talk about those, but I'd like to. So he's emphasising masculinity as a performance, that it's in a certain context, it has a certain purpose. And he says that it's, as well as it being performed, it's also received. And it can be interpreted in many ways.
And that seems to be what he sees as his original point in this article, really, isn't it? That, okay, there's different ideas of performed masculinity, but we're neglecting the fact that it's received in different ways by academics, practitioners, but for more relevant to us, you know, like the general public and potential clients.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's a thing about gamifying masculinity, which is in that, isn't it? So
yeah, do you mind talking to that? Because I was a little, I understand it as a game in terms of making choices.
Yeah.
But if you...
Okay, so one of the examples he uses is if I'm a gang boss in East London, for example, and I want to recruit some more soldiers, I turn on the uber masculine charisma. So I've got this is all me making it up, by the way, but I've got my, you know, blacked out Mercedes, lowered suspension with really big rims, and
you know this very well, Zac.
Yeah, I've got the subwoofers pumping out, like, you know, whatever. What do they listen to? Drum and bass? I don't know. Probably not. And yeah, it's very much sort of, I'm the personification of the top of the dominance hierarchy. You can join me. If you're with me, then you'll do well, because I'm so strong and powerful and assertive that I'm going to make loads of money and you're going to be part of that. Which is a bit like, it's just the same when you go for a job in, you know, a really good company, and you go in the lift and you think, wow, this is quite a nice building, and then they give you a coffee in the waiting room and it's like really nice, and it's the same thing, isn't it? Yeah. So I'm just very suspicious of how quickly we start going down the what's so special about masculinity in that, isn't it just... There's a few points in this article where I started to think, this is very sloppy. We're just talking about masculinity without drawing clear definitions around anything here. And it's a lot of like people chucking ideas around, but which is fine, but I don't get the definition of anything.
The word that kept coming to mind, and he didn't mention it, but I wonder if he is inspired by the concept, is fluidity. I just felt, great, masculinity is fluid, but
not that though, is it? Because you've got balls on the outside of your body. Women have balls on the inside of their body. You know, let's do just a quick diversion into hopefully not stereotypes but archetypes. There's an action orientation and objectivity to masculinity, whereas femininity is about subjectivity. You're the receiver. The male's a penetrator. The female's a receiver. This is probably going to sound really awful, but you know, we're like, our bodies are metaphors of who we are at a deep level. So
Yeah.
Where's all that in all these theories? He's covered a lot of theory there, and I'm not hearing anything linked to our deeper nature. It's all
There's
just sort of
nothing,
intellectual.
nothing biological and nothing evolutionary. I know.
I just felt really
It
uncomfortable with
really,
it.
yeah. And the fluidity is about the roles. That's the fluidity I was picking up. You know,
Yeah.
being different in different situations, being differently received by differently people on different occasions.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said earlier about Damien is a therapist, and I wonder if, because he's stepping into this talk about this stuff, which is all very sociological and very like what's the word? I just wonder whether he's lost his voice as a therapist. It's not. It doesn't feel very grounded. It feels like he's just kind of trying to talk about all these ideas, but none of it's about his actual clients in the room, if that makes sense. He's just kind of made this quite sort of airy theoretical point, which I kind of agree with, that it's about
I think he's been quite rigorous in gathering together a few interesting different ways
it's
of
a good
doing
route
things.
through the theory.
Yeah.
But I'm not, for me, it was just like, well, where's your voice? He's just sort of.
Well, it feels, now you're talking, it feels like a postmodern deconstruction.
Yeah, I don't know what it means to the man or woman in the street, basically. I mean, what I'm getting from it is that there's massive issues with the unidirectional, this is the word that is used, bandied around, unidirectional nature of hegemonic masculinity. And just to break that down really quickly, hegemonic masculinity is the Gramscian idea that power is...
It's always up for grabs. Is that Gramsci or is that Foucault?
It's like a pyramid, and wait, I'm struggling for words because I'm trying to remember what the originality of Gramsci's theory was. It was a sort of, I think what was original about it was the sort of subtleness of power, the kind of function of power. So it would be, rather than a king, sorry, go on.
And you shift it from class to other groupings?
Gramsci, well, he was around, he was in the early 1900s, so he was still thinking in terms of means of production and stuff like that. But he wanted, basically, he was the head of the Italian Communist Party, and he realized that a kind of full-on frontal attack on capitalism wasn't going to work. So what he was advocating was a sort of quite a subtle undermining of capitalism in what he called the march through the institutions. So you go in to education and you start, if enough communist teachers go into education, and they'll start changing the way that students are taught. Hey, guess what's happened in the 90s? That's what happened in the UK and the US since the 80s. And so there's education, there's all the institutions, which you can kind of see that agenda's got quite far. The media, look at the BBC, that's very right on. And then other theorists took his concept of power, and the Foucauldian thing is about the discourse, so how the language we use creates our reality. So that's also very new. It's like a kind of added nuance, which is how discursive power works. So even the people using the words that are kind of facilitating that power dynamic aren't even conscious, because the words exist independently of them, and they're just they're reproducing the power. I think that's enough.
But clarity around those. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
But yeah, then some theorists in the 80s started taking the idea of the Gramscian hegemonic power and saying, oh, that we can fit that to the gender theory. Oh yeah, that fits really well. Yeah. So let's start doing that. So when I went to see Dr. Michael Beattie, you know, the guy from the London Gender Identity Clinic.
Yes.
He's very articulate. He really loves the idea of hegemonic masculinity, and he sort of kept. I mean, well, he wasn't dogmatic about it. He was just like, that's what I'm into. So it's very much, and I felt like he was very much it was a workshop in London recently, you know, early, when was it? March 2020.
Yeah.
But I felt like Dr. Beattie's presentation was very kind of current, you know, that's the way things are, that's the thinking, you know, he's working at a high level in an NHS institution that's working with transgender and, you know, gender clients. So this is very kind of on message, the hegemonic masculinity thing and the performative thing around masculinity. Yeah, I don't know why I got onto a bit of a tangent there. Anyway, I'm still struggling with the hegemonic theory, but I do really like aspects of Foucauldian theory. I think that, you know, it's true that in order to kind of resist something, you have to enter the discourse, and by entering the discourse, you're kind of giving away some of your power. For example, the family court system, you know, in order to see your child, you have to start dealing with Kafkas and then start dealing with family court. And by doing so, it's a very reductionist way of conceptualizing you as a human being, as a parent, and your child is, there's a cost to entering a discourse and using the language. So Foucault, for me, he was right about that stuff. Massive tangent.
Interesting.
What did you want me to do? You wanted me to do something. Oh, the gamifying.
Yeah, gamifying.
Right. I did write something on it.
Did you?
Let me just game. What could I have called it? I liked his point. I think this is linked. Oh yeah. That he keeps saying, this is a good line, I think. Masculinity is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, that's a great line. Yeah.
Yeah, and the audience itself has all kinds of investments in masculinity. So I think that one sentence sort of sums up his thesis. And then the thing about the game, he's saying recognizing a level of knowingness about the masculinity game, especially among men, is also important. Masculinity does not ultimately reside in a social system or an individual, but in the inevitable variation in interpretations of that masculinity and the way its importance waxes and wanes. And I would just say, yeah, that's fine, but what's so special about masculinity? What about anything? You know, like, what about
femininity?
Oh yeah, femininity, but it could be anything. And I just feel really strongly that when reading this article, and I do think he accepts a lot of intersectional theory, and I think I wrote somewhere in my notes when I was reading it, I can't find it now, but that I think intersectionality is actually a neurosis. I think it's actually a disease that the more we look at, the more we think about, the further away we get from our own nature and our own source of overcoming all this fragmentation and bile. And it's just so clear to me that it's producing diversity. Obsession is producing prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
It's manufacturing the prejudice that it's saying that it's interested in wiping out. And I found a few different examples of that in the piece. I just feel really getting much clearer on that, just for me at the moment. Don't know how you feel, Sue.
I can only talk in a very small way about how white heterosexual men are deemed to be so privileged, when actually in the hierarchy of who gets the most attention, actually the white heterosexual men, there's very little research into white heterosexual men and their experiences of the world. I just don't find them privileged on the whole. The white heterosexual.
There's no evidence that they are privileged, that I've seen. Is there?
I just think they're overlooked. I think there's I don't know if there still is, but I think there was a white men's studies course at, I think it was one of the Midland universities. But then again, that was looking at it as white men being privileged, and
yeah. I mean,
I think a lot of these theories, how can I put it, are just critical of men and white men in particular.
Yeah,
working.
I think I may differ with you in terms of where I want to go with it, because I just think that entering into, by responding to this situation, by looking at just what happens for white men, I just think is part of the same problem. It's just
it feels a contradiction, and it feels hypocritical to me. I think that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I feel like a lot of people get this. Maybe not so many people feel able to talk about it or to write about it, because it's very stigmatized, isn't it? If you've got a job, I mean, in a sense, we're lucky because we're private therapists, so we can not really lose our jobs unless we get, I don't know, really bad PR or something. But I think there's a lot of people out there that have, there's a lot of people that are interested in this stuff, and it's a bit like, what you were talking about with Donald Trump and Brexit. There's obviously a lot of people who wanted something different. That's why they voted for Brexit and Donald Trump. And I think a lot of those people probably know that the discourse around masculinity is just not real. It's not helpful.
Not relevant.
It's not relevant to them in their normal lives.
No. Maybe that's the point we just need to make.
It's very simple, I think. I mean, I looked at a really nice short video on George Orwell the other day by the School of Life. Alain de Botton. He curates that, and he still does the kind of voiceover for their little animated videos, and they do introductions to philosophers and writers and stuff. And it's so, it almost brought tears to my eyes. Oh no, what's happened? I lost you there.
Something happened?
No, my screen just changed. Anyway, the one he did, it's only like 13 minutes long. It's really worth watching, on George Orwell, especially now, at this point in where we are in history. And it was just about George Orwell's conviction that ordinary people are inspirational, and they really have a wisdom and a warmth that you can't find in the elites, in Parliament or in the kind of hoity-toity whatever you know, it was slightly different when he was writing, but it wasn't really different. It's what we would call the liberal elites now, who are the sorts of people. I mean, this is a very sweeping statement, so I'm not, but the sorts of people are obsessing and writing and publishing and thinking and always getting more and more kind of derivative about their theories of masculinity and gender and intersectionality. For me, I just feel like, oh, especially therapists, you know, because we're supposed to be helping people. How is this helping people? You know, like, really, is this? I think I just feel like academia, for me, I'm not sure sometimes what the point is. And I think that's probably being in the process of being exploded by podcasts and all this amazing content that we can get for free now. What is it that people in academia actually do? You know, like, it's, how does it, what's the function? How's it helping anyone? Where's it creating value?
Well, I mean, that's certainly the lens I was looking at this chapter through is, you know, how's it going to help me work with men in my practice? I mean, the one thing it does present is how many different ways there are of looking at masculinity. But when you come from a humanist perspective, you know, we encounter everyone as different and unique, and
yeah,
you know,
it's a given. It's a given. It should be a given.
Yeah, I mean, he did talk about, as you said, the charisma kind of performance, and he also talked about the body briefly, didn't he?
Yeah, he like, masculinity is located in the penis.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, that doesn't resonate with me. Maybe it does. Yeah, like on some level it's definitely
well
true.
there is, for me, there is something about masculinity and penetrating the world.
Yeah, like, exactly. Yeah, like I said earlier, it's true.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, the body is a performance for some men, isn't it? You know, presenting aspects of their body, whether that's muscular or tattoos or what they're wearing. You know, the body is part of the performance, I think.
Yeah, and what was the theory around attractiveness? Sort of sexual capital. Is that what it was called? Erotic capital.
Erotic, yes, erotic capital.
It was a challenge to. I think that for me that was completely bang on. You know, people have different levels of erotic capital. If you're a stunning young woman with a great body, you can get things that other people can't get. Some men figure this, you know, some attractive men, I don't even think you have to be attractive. It's just the kind of confidence can help. Then it can become an extremely powerful way to meet your ends.
I was interested that he said being attractive is a drawback for some men in some situations. And
so like, especially in intellectual circles. I didn't know that. I've never heard that before.
I didn't know that.
But I do remember distinctly, this is slightly off point, but I used to be a journalist and I went to do work experience at The Guardian, and the woman put in sort of to manage me, she was really nice. She was quite young. She was like probably in her mid-20s, and I think she was I think her heritage was Indian or Bangladeshi. I can't remember, but I remember feeling very, very white and very male in that it was the features desk, and I was like, wow, I'm like the sort of I'm very white and very very male. Yeah, that was just I don't know what my point is there. Oh yeah, you were saying, you know, how some men are at disadvantage. I remember feeling like, wow, how have I got in here? Yeah, because I'm not a, whatever the word is, I'm not a minority of some sort.
Right.
So maybe that's a kind of a prop to the Guardian for inviting me in to do work experience, even though I am white and male.
Yeah.
So thank you, Guardian. It was a nice couple of weeks.
Good for them.
I was in my early 20s. No, I was about 21, I think. Just looking through my notes here to check. Got any? I felt like there was some collusion or sloppiness with some of these terms, like toxic. The word toxic.
Yes.
We're just sort of blithely letting these negative judgments stand, where I would be challenging them all the way down. So where am I looking? Yeah, there's a bit where he says, in practice, scholars frequently use the theory of hegemonic power in unanticipated ways. For example, by invoking the idea of static and toxic traits as making up hegemony. For example, stoicism, risk-taking, and violence. Well, I'm sorry, but stoicism is not, for me, is not a static or toxic trait. It's a brilliant ancient discipline that can really help people. Not all people, but risk-taking as well. You can't do anything unless you're willing to take risks.
I did have a little shifty around who he published things with, and I know he's a contributor to the Huffington Post, which would indicate that he is more of from the liberal perspective, isn't he?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. It talks about a few of the lenses which the performances can be viewed through. He thinks there's not multiple masculinities, there's only masculinity, but there are multiple interpretations of masculinity, which is an interesting idea. Like you said, in the eye of the beholder. And he asks, does the audience notice bodies, eroticism, charisma? Are they holding the social structures in mind of, you know, what men are more powerful, or where women get their power from, or both? Or are they looking at masculinity through a lens of toxicity or benevolence? I thought that was quite an interesting kind of idea.
Yeah, because you can take that quite far, can't you? If you're looking at it, if you're looking at an angry young black man, let's say, because we're talking about black people, you're looking at an angry young black man who's been arrested and he's got out on bail, and you look at his behavior and you say, well, that's because you've got a benevolent view of masculinity. You say, well, he's just trying to meet his needs in this environment that isn't really supporting him. But I think actually the writer of this article gives an example of a Hispanic gang leader who gets out of jail. While he's in jail, he has to be the tough guy and the belligerent, you know,
Latino man
Latino
transitioning.
guy. Yeah, and then he comes out and he gets the right support, and he just is so ready to drop all that crap.
Yeah.
Because that's not who he really is, and that's not
Transformed.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's real masculine. Well, that's healthy masculinity. That's mature masculinity. The kind of machismo, the gang version of it. I mean, I don't know how helpful it is to kind of label different types of masculinity, but it's just there's a pro-social one and there's a sort of antisocial one.
That was exactly the word that was going around in my head. You know, I think we're all inherently pro-social. You know, there's probably a tiny percentage of people who, no matter how you work with them or be with them, they're not going to be pro-social. But I think most of us, given the right environment, given a supportive, nurturing environment, we're pro-social. We want to be connected, we want to belong, we want to find our place, we want to give and receive, and so that's all I was thinking was for me we're all pro-social. Give us the right environment, and I don't know, 96% of us will be good people, worthwhile people.
It's really true in my experience, I feel like.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's really about giving someone, what therapy does is it gives someone that space, maybe for the first time in their life, to feel what it's like when someone else sees that part of them, gives that to them for an hour or 50 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's so powerful. And how do we do that if we're pathologizing masculinity? I don't think we can.
So in a way, we're looking through the benevolent lens, aren't we?
Always.
Yeah, even the kinds of antisocial behaviour, we're not condoning it at all, but we're understanding it. We're seeking to understand it as, you know, something that needs correcting, but there's something behind the behaviour that needs help, you know.
And the correction happens from within. It's not imposed from without. Going back to the Manu Pisano article again, for me, he was sort of writing as though it's our duty as therapists to sort of impose this worldview on our clients and show them the error of their ways. And it's just like, oh my God, that's not therapy.
Kind of to make men a project and undo their masculinity.
Yes, that's how he put it. I find that very disturbing.
Yeah.
I find it, I get quite angry about that, actually.
It's very, very presumptuous, isn't it? Very presumptuous.
Yeah. There was an interesting bit in the doing gender section where he's thinking, there's a lot of good research mentioned in this article, isn't there?
Yeah, there is.
It was quite hard hitting, this one. So men in a South African jail who were raped were then considered by other inmates to basically have become women, or at least have feminine transformation.
Yeah.
And then they could be considered as wives of the more dominant men. And this sort of played into the active passive, giving, receiving tropes, which aren't just tropes. I think there's something very deep in masculine, feminine qualities that are to do with active, passive, giving, receiving, home and holding the line of the boundary and the known and the unknown worlds. So feminine is in the known world, masculine is on the edge of the known world, going into the unknown.
And that's not to say there can't be any crossover, but
no. There's something that is very I find in the literature since the 80s is very unwilling to acknowledge that there are some deep, very deep truths in these ideas of like what I was just saying.
Mm.
You know, the evolutionary perspectives, the biological perspectives, like what actually have we been doing for the last 100,000 years? Well, not always, but mostly the men have been hunting and fighting. Mostly, but not always, the women have been raising kids and cooking.
Mm-hmm.
Not always, though, but there's. I mean, that's got us at a deep level. There's a sort of inheritance, and we can't just explain it all away because it's, you know, if women want to go to work and not have kids, that's okay, but that doesn't mean that we don't have this inheritance. You know, the world's changed very quickly, hasn't it? In 1,000 years, we just entered modernity.
Something deeper that structures a lot of our behaviour, a lot of our longings, which academic theorising misses, doesn't it?
Completely.
Yeah,
that's what I was repeatedly feeling when I was reading this, because he covers a lot of the theory, is that this is all so myopic. Like there's just, yeah, I kind of want a more expansive explanation, a bit like a Jungian, you know, the way Carl Jung, who would be interested in anthropology and deep depth psychology and ancient civilization and history and medicine and you know, that's kind of where I feel like we need to be. I don't understand what value this kind of activity brings.
Absolutely. We ready for a bit of conclusion, or are you? Are there some
yeah, I think. How long have we been? We don't want it to go on too long, do we?
I think an hour.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's great.
Yeah.
So, why can't I speak? Yeah, just one quick thing before that. You know, there's a bit called Manhood Acts, and the idea of Manhood Acts is that there's certain performative acts that are linked to masculinity, and there's a quote here: "Manhood acts were about unidirectional power aimed at claiming privilege, eliciting deference, and resisting exploitation." But I just wrote underneath that, why can't that be womanhood acts? I mean, I can think of loads of examples where women have done things like that. Claiming privilege, yeah. Eliciting deference, yeah. Resisting exploitation, yeah. So I just don't. For me, a lot.
Why isn't that a human?
For me, a lot. Yeah, exactly. For me, a lot of this stuff. Hearing a lot of these theorists, the way they're almost like obsessing over masculinity and excluding everything else, for me they're just reproducing the prejudice that they're saying that they're trying to fight. They're saying they're trying to fight hegemonic masculinity, but this is, I don't understand it. That's what the point is.
Yes, my heart sank a bit in almost the final paragraph where he says we've become more ambivalent about the masculinity game. So he is problematizing.
He's definitely problematizing.
Yeah, aspects of masculinity. Why are people so reluctant to try and understand in a compassionate way? Human.
They're playing the ultimate power game, Sue. So they're saying that there's a thing called hegemonic masculinity, and by saying that, they're taking power. That on some level, there's a sort of appropriation of power, even though it's what they're saying isn't real, but it's giving them more authority. And so they can keep problematizing something, so then that puts them in a position of high priest, so they can kind of say what the solution is. But if there's no problem, they don't have any power.
Yes. So they focus in on a problem, identify that, and then they
make it really complicated and write these books about it, so that then, and they've become very good at it. So now it's coming through in all these ways, like Dr. Michael Beattie. He was very eloquent when I saw him a couple of months ago. But the thing about it was that I'd say most people in the room probably accepted the hegemonic masculinity idea, or had already accepted it, because it's become so. It's just become.
Well, it's like the air that you breathe. It's
yeah, exactly. And it's like the Foucauldian discursive, like, power discourse. It's working in that way. So it's quite ironic that I just find the whole thing quite ironic, actually. Yeah.
It's almost a projection, isn't it, about where the power lies? Yeah.
Which is what, of course, you find that in the family court system a lot, in the feminist movement. Like, you get all this stuff about domestic abuse, which is a horrible thing. And I'm not saying that women don't experience awful things through that, but a lot of the language in the family court, you know, if someone mentions the words domestic abuse, then there's a kind of whole range of ways that can be identified. And one of them is controlling behavior, manipulative behavior, you know. And it's like, well, using the word domestic abuse to alienate your child's father, that's pretty manipulative. It's pretty controlling. It's pretty abusive. I mean, it's hard to think of something that's more abusive. So that's projection often.
And unquestioned.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So in conclusion, different scholars, masculinity scholars, feminist scholars, writers, commentators of the men's movement, got different views of masculinity. That's what he's saying. It's done by men but interpreted by others. There's always different perspectives in the performance review. So he talks about reviewing theatre. You know, there's always a different.
I think the longer I'm thinking about this article, the further and further. I don't like. It doesn't resonate with me, much of this, I'm afraid.
No.
I just saw another thing I wrote. There's a quote. Black women argue that discrimination is becoming increasingly specialized, even if white women have won certain privileges. We know about all that. You know, the way feminists have, there's more and more kind of rarefied hierarchies of victimhood coming out all the time. And it feels like, sorry, what's his name again? The author?
Damian Ridge.
Damian Ridge. It feels like Damian Ridge is, rather than moving away from that, he's sort of adding to that process of just making everything much more of a nightmare for me. I just don't see how this is helping anyone. Like, we're just creating more and more kind of hierarchies of victimhood, more and more overcomplicated, diverse, just no.
Yeah, I've got postmodern relativity. I wrote down as a, you know, yeah, and I also made the comment: everyone has won and all must have prizes. You know, that kind of dodo.
Yeah. Oh God.
Yeah.
Let's get real. Let's actually get real. You know, let's help real people.
You know, No, I'm a bit speechless, actually. A bit speechless as to how to end it, really. I was really positive about the symbolic interactionism, and that, you know, that it's dynamic. That kind of fitted. I like the idea that various aspects of masculinity are either welcomed or ignored, or
I liked that.
with disgust or repulsion. You know, that felt quite real and quite.
There was a thing about virtual reality. So some of the performative aspects of masculinity, he seems to be saying or agreeing that suggests that there's a virtual reality aspect to it, because you're. I don't agree with that, because I think if you're performing and the audience is seeing what it's seeing, then that's real. Why is that virtual? So I couldn't get my head around that idea, but he mentioned it a couple of times and he seemed to agree with it. So for me, there's a couple of ideas in here that I think are valuable, especially the kaleidoscope idea, which is your word actually. But apart from that, there's a lot of holes for me, and there's a lot of unhelpful material and I'm slightly disappointed that he hasn't. I can't hear his voice as a therapist. He seems like he's speaking to academics that aren't really in the field more than therapists who are in the field. And isn't that what we're doing here?
And the focus was on men in isolation, really. Not you know, certainly not in relation to women. And
and there wasn't a lot in well, I mean, there doesn't have to always be, but there wasn't much positive stuff, was there, about positive masculinity?
No,
it doesn't really always have to be. I just noticed that a lot in literature. I did like the game, the thing about the gamified aspects of masculinity. I think there's something in that, and I think there's something in his idea that masculinity is in the eye of the beholder. And the audience has all kinds of investments in masculinity. Great point. So maybe that's a good place to leave it.
Shall we?
I feel like we're getting a little bit more kind of animated now. This is our third video, isn't it? So kind of getting into the rhythm a little bit more.
Yes, I'm a little bit less self-conscious. Just a little bit.
Well, thanks for doing the intro. I think it was really good today.
So
I will. Thank you. I'll choose the next chapter of the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology, and we'll do it again soon.
Brilliant. Okay.
Thank you.